Hello, and welcome to the No Bad Questions podcast, where I try to learn in a conversational manner by sitting down with people who have interesting careers, important lessons to tell, or inspiring stories. I hope that you learn something too. If you want to support the podcast, please follow or subscribe on your platform of choice. You can also like or comment to boost the algorithms or share out to your network to make sure it gets more views. But ultimately, and what I hope you choose to do, is listen to the very end. With that, we'll start today's podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the No Bad Questions podcast. I am joined today by Brian Unell. Brian is a seasoned healthcare consultant, healthcare leader, father, and author. And the author is the main thing that I asked him to join me today for essentially a New Year's episode, because his book, as I understand it, has a lot of lessons that we might take into daily lives and could make good New Year's resolutions. Now, I say as I understand it because I need to confess, as part of the intro to this podcast, while Everyday Leadership, Brian's book, is on my reading list is admittedly quite long, and every time I break out the Kindle, I end up distracted over onto YouTube or something like this that, sucks up those dopamine reflectors and so forth. So Brian's on my list, but Brian's got a leadership legacy that he drags behind him in healthcare, and based on all of that positive from some of the folks who've worked for him over the years, I knew when I heard about his book, I wanted to have him on, and it's been many months in the making, but we were able to put it together over here. Christmas 2023, we were able to get it booked just in time for New Year's headed into 2024. Brian, thanks for being with me on No Bad Questions.
Thank you, David, for having me. I appreciate the confession up front and the opportunity to be here today.
So, what is everyday leadership?
The concept of everyday leadership was born out of the premise that you can make a difference in people's lives and you don't have to have a role or title to do so. My wife will describe it as you could walk into Costco and you could be the general manager of the store. You could be the regional VP who's there for once a quarter. You could be the person behind the return counter. You could be the person in the return line, and you can make or ruin lots of people's days, no matter what your role is in that situation. And just by through your communication and your mindset. And so that's what half the book is about: communication, and half the book is about mindset.
Okay. So, do you invert that? Can a customer, be a leader in this?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in the line as a return customer, and you can make or ruin the people behind that counter's desk, right? You can make or ruin the people who are in line with you, depending on how long you're waiting and your attitude about it. People feel negative vibes, people feel negative energy. If you're really frustrated, right, it just transcends your being into others, right? It creates an atmosphere and an environment and a culture to some degree. And, Costco is successful because it pays their employees more and values their employees and those kinds of things. But you can't always impact, or you can't always determine who your customers are, right? So the customers absolutely can make or ruin people's day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this element of mindset I knew was in the book, despite not having read it. I don't know if it was a conversation you and I had, or again, one of your former employees that you've managed over the years we talked about. But this was one of the major reasons I wanted to have you on to talk about this, because I feel like this mindset that your book is advocating is sorely lacking. Is that what made you want to write it, or was there some other motivation?
Ironically, the book was 10 years in the making, David, and I have an undergrad degree in statistics. I only applied to undergraduate schools that did not require essays, and that is not a joke. I literally never thought I would actually do it. But I've been keeping topics in my phone for 10 years to write a book that was originally going to be called Common Sense Ain't So Common. And it was really around observations that I had around people and behaviors, silly things like where you walk or where you stand. I go to a lot of sporting events, and there's aisles, and people walk up the left side or walk down the left side all the time, as opposed to using the right side. Same thing in the airport, right? People go into airports and it's like they're entering a foreign country and don't know how to act, right? And recognize that there's other people that are walking around them or maybe need to go someplace, or you're boarding your plane and you're halfway out into the concourse, right? I mean, it's just fascinating to me, the behaviors of people in general. And so there's going to be silly things like that around just how you can impact other people's lives. And I ended up hiring a book coach as part of the process, because I knew that I wasn't going to be able to write this thing. And I thought I was going to need a lot of help ghostwriting. And it turns out that I wrote 99% of the book. He probably wrote in total a page and a half out of 150 pages. And I mean, just a sentence here, a sentence there. He wrote one paragraph as an intro section, which I really liked and kept. But in general, I thought I was going to need a lot of help. But it turns out I had a lot of content. And when he was helping me just sort of organize it and put it together, he said, who's your book targeted to? And I was telling him about it, et cetera. And this was several weeks in. And he said, dude, your book's about leadership. And I said, well, really, it's about everyday leadership, because it's not about what people perceive, traditionally as leadership. People put leadership up on a pedestal. People think leadership is someone else's responsibility. And one of the things I talk about in the book is when my daughter was 2 and my son was upset about something, she just went up and grabbed his leg and gave him a big hug. And it made his demeanor completely change, right? And that's, you may sound silly to other folks that a 2-year-old can provide leadership, but she did in that moment, right? She was able to go in and completely change what was going on in the situation. And that's what leadership is at the end of the day.
So I think that's a great motivation and a great story about how you came to this, and the point about applying for schools with no essays certainly is ironic in the rear view mirror. So do you explicitly define leadership in the book? You kind of alluded there to your sort of definition of leadership, and I think leadership is something that everybody's got maybe a slightly different variant of in their mind's eye of how it's defined. But how do you define leadership?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. I think it's extremely subjective, and what I try to do is redefine it in a way and to create some criteria around it throughout the book. And again, about how you can make a difference in other people's lives. I mean, really, that's what it's about. And making a difference. And so my tagline of the book is "You will make a difference," with the subtitle. And I've been trying to trademark that, which is a separate conversation for another podcast around trying to figure out how to trademark something. But, I do believe you will make a difference. Whether it's positive or negative is up to you. And that's really what the whole book is about. And it's a series of vignettes and stories that hopefully people can relate to about work and life and as a parent. And I don't expect everyone to take the nugget out of every chapter, but my favorite kind of books that I read are where I can take a nugget out of the book and apply it in my life. And so I try to leave a nugget at the end of each chapter or vignette for someone to take and hopefully apply to theirs to make a difference in a positive way.
It sounds like, you talk about you will make a difference and everyday leadership and the opportunities and mindset that comes in every day, that your book coach said that this is a leadership book. It sounds almost to me like, and I don't mean this in any sort of negative, maybe even a positive, that it's almost a self-help book to change your mindset. What would you say to that?
It's interesting you mentioned that, because when you talk about the different categories where you would put books up and you have to label them, whether it be Amazon or Barnes and Noble or even a library, you have to basically define how you want to tag it. And when people read it, they were like, this is actually a really interesting slant on self-help, as much as anything. There's business components to it. There's parenting components to it. And there's a lot of just, like you said, how can I make myself better and how can I make a positive difference?
So you set out to do common sense isn't common. You end up doing everyday leadership. You're getting feedback that it's self-help. Are you, how do I want to phrase it? Is the reception to your ideas changing your own views about it, right? You had an intent that you went into it with, and as you get sort of audience feedback, is it changing how you think about it? Do you think yourself as a self-help guru now? No,
I don't. By no means am I a guru of anything. I will say that it has helped validate and reaffirm the beliefs and the topics of the book. The people always ask, well, how's the book going? Or what does success look like? And my goal when I set out to do it was to basically, if my two kids read it and didn't make the same stupid mistakes as their dad did, that's success. Right. And the fact that I actually got through the process of writing a book and publishing and getting it out there in the world and commercializing it is just a huge accomplishment in itself. Right. For good or for bad, I had, when I start out to write, I basically had no idea how long the book was going to be or anything like that. But I ended up writing over 100,000 words. And the first book is 30,000 words. So I have another book that's essentially done that is focused on building high-performing teams and building culture in organizations. So I don't know what I'm going to do with it yet because it's got a lot of work that needs to happen on the editing process. But it's really the corollary, because this book, like you just identified, is how to help yourself help others. The other is how to translate that and to build it into high-performing teams and cultures and organizations.
Okay. So you overshot the necessary mark, if you will, of 30,000 words by, triple. You just sit down and it started coming out. I mean, you talked about hiring a book coach, but how did that all just get out of your brain? Was it just 8 hours a day? Or, I talked to Dr. Todd DeWitt about his writing. He talked about hammering out a book in like a day. And so everybody's obviously got different methods of writing. How did you get that much content out there?
It was over 18 months. So I, for good or for bad, had quit my job. I notified the organization that I was leaving in the summer of 19, and I hung around. It's good English. Hung around the organization because I wanted to make sure there's a smooth transition. And I stayed till February 7th of 2020. And, it was a perfect time to quit your job had there not been a pandemic 6 weeks away. And I had 20 different opportunities of things I was looking at. And I turned down a CFO opportunity at a private equity backed operation that because they wanted me to move to Baltimore. And I just wasn't ready to move with my son in 6th grade, my family being here in Atlanta. So I basically turned it down, and everything else dried up when the pandemic hit. So I found myself with time. And so I was doing some consulting work, which helped pay the bills and put food on the table and those kinds of things. But I had a lot of time to write. And so I spent, the next year and a half basically just documenting all the different thoughts that I had over the past 10 years. And, some of them went nowhere. I have a giant section still called cutting room floor of things that are sort of half baked. And we'll see if anything ever comes of that. But I really enjoyed the process. I thought that writing was going to be the hard part. And when I started doing it, it was great. And then you have to go through the editing and publishing jungle. And I thought I was done. And then you enter the commercialization jungle. And, you're a recovering consultant like I am, right? You're always in sales, but commercializing something is completely different.
Right.
And I'd never commercialized anything in my life. So you have this podcast, obviously, and commercializing this. But I fortunately had an opportunity to join a startup. And the commercialization of the startup and the commercialization of the book basically happened at the same time. And so it was a learning experience. I was leveraging both situations to help each other, if that makes any sense to you. And it was a tremendous learning experience. It was a complete blind spot for me because it was just something I had never done before.
You're not the first one who said that, the writing is not the hard part. The editing and all the stuff that comes later is the hard part. One of the things I want to hinge on, there's a couple things in there that I'd like to talk about, but the first of which is, these are your gatherings and thoughts and observations from 10 years. And I deliberately did a thin intro today so that there's room during the conversation for this question, which is, why should people listen to your thoughts on leadership? What leadership have you done? Can you tell the audience? And I don't mean that rudely. I mean it like, can you tell the audience why or from where you draw these lessons to bring to the table?
So as I mentioned, recovering consultant in the Big Five world, and had entered in that journey after graduate school. I met my wife in graduate school. We both entered Big Five consulting. She lasted 7.5 years, and I lasted 6.5. And it was back in the days when Ernst & Young had a very large consulting practice in healthcare, and they sold the whole practice off to Capgemini, and then Capgemini sold us the healthcare portion off to Accenture. So I had 3 companies, but only one job in my first 6.5 years of my career, and was able to watch a lot of different aspects of culture in those different organizations, right? You had privately held partnership models, and when you got to Accenture, it was publicly traded model. And, Accenture is great. I mean, tons of smart people. I really enjoyed it. but having a content-rich nature practice like healthcare, where deal sizes are in the million, $1 million, $2 million range, isn't going to be successful in the long run when you're competing against, large, tremendous outsourcing projects, and they're looking for $100 million projects, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or manufacturing or consumer product goods, where the Fortune 500 companies live, right? There's only so many
Right.
Fortune 500, providers out there. And so I realized that there wasn't going to be a long-term career there, because the math was never going to work. And so I ended up, being able to transition into industry, which was great, et cetera. And one of the interesting dichotomies that I realized, and I write about this in the book, and it didn't hit me at the time, was that when I was in business school, or earning our MBA and Master in Health Administration degrees, I was in business school, and we would talk about organizational behavior, and we would talk about the sort of characteristics of servant leadership and those mentalities. And then I would go down to my Master in Health Administration classes, and essentially they were teaching us how to go toe to toe with physicians, and how to basically have command and control structures that were around in the 1980s, but they were still teaching, and still in many grad school programs today for health administration, still teaching those concepts.
Mm-hmm.
And so my belief is that these concepts that they're teaching the business school really need to be brought into these health systems. And so watching health systems as a consultant and then as a executive, you realize the ability to make change and the ability to have servant leader models really didn't exist. And I had an opportunity to do a transformation, or to lead a transformation effort, where I combined 540 people across 6 different organizations in the health system, to bring them all together and to transform it. And they had those 540 people had 140 different job descriptions when we started. And we brought them together, and we had under 100, and we added new functions along the way. And, I tell people the 2 biggest things that I'm proud of aren't the fact that I brought in tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of recurring net revenue improvements to the organization, but was the fact of our employee engagement scores and participation rate and scores were really high. In fact, all of our patient access teams that joined this organization, this new centralized or consolidated function, as opposed to used to work at their facilities locally, all of them had higher employee engagement scores than their facilities that they worked at across the board the last 2 years I was there. And in fact, the last 2 years I was there, our employee turnover rate had dropped from the industry average of 20 to 25% to under 10%. And so to me, making those huge differences in people's lives and in the organization, because turnover and the churn of that is tremendous cost, both to people and to the organization. And so it just made a huge difference. And I realized that this could actually work. And the team grew as the health system grew, and I ended up leading over 1,500 people when I left. And it was one of the best things I had ever done. And I was able to build a team, and it was, that believed in these concepts of putting the culture first and hiring people based off of that, and focusing on the frontline resources and those kinds of things. And it just makes a huge difference.
Right. I think that everything you said is good evidence of why people should listen. I mean, there's, the opportunity at the end there to be managing 1,500 people, but also the scaling within that, the employee engagement. And I actually want to double down, just for folks who don't know, because you mentioned patient access. Some folks out there who don't live in healthcare that listen to this might be, well, what's patient access? In the 1980s, they might call it admitting or registration, and it is one of the highest turnover areas of healthcare. So taking it to 10%, I mean, just super impressive, and I think speaks a lot to what you must have been able to accomplish at that organization. So I just wanted to double down on that.
Well, thank you.
So thank you for walking through that, so we can kind of establish those bona fides of leadership. We started out talking a bit about mindset and how you can carry a leadership mindset into everyday interactions. One of the things, and I asked about, do you feel like it's missing as part of your motivation to write the book? And I think that not so much, but in general, then I want to zoom out and ask, I mean, do you think, it might not have been a motivation to write the book, but do you think that we are missing some of this mindset? And besides reading your book, what can we do to get some of this mindset back in our lives?
I think it's really about connections. At the end of the day, I think we're so focused in the moment now. There's this instant gratification piece. that we all have because of these devices have created that, right? Things that we used to have to spend time trying to find, or you may never find. When you and I were kids, we'd have to go pick up an encyclopedia, right? And, our kids, right? I've got a 15-year-old. I know you've got two 7 and 8-year-old. I mean, it was really funny. My wife and I were having a conversation last year, and I said something about a phone book, and my son looks at me and goes, "What's a phone book?" Right? Like, and you have to go and explain to him, well, there's this thing that used to come once a year, and there were the white pages and the yellow pages, and you start talking about it, it's like it's literally a foreign concept. He's looking at me like I've got 6 heads on my shoulders, and he's 15, right? And so you just have to realize there's this world now where everything is available all the time, right? And I think what we've not done is invested in people and invested in relationships. We've become so transactional in nature, and our organizations are treating people as numbers, right? Whether you're customers or whether you are employees. And I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges that our culture and society face, is that everybody's a number. And when you dehumanize people in that way, then you can begin to treat people in a negative way or act badly and justify all of those behavioral things that you'll see on the news every day, whether it's on the right or on the left from a politics spectrum. It's all terrible because, again, we're just dehumanizing people across the board. And so to me, I feel like that it's going to be a locally, bottom up type effort to try to change it all. And hopefully my book can, be a part of that. It's not the answer, but it can be part of the answer, hopefully.
Yeah. I think that's a great answer to the question.
Be careful what you ask, David. I'll answer it.
Well, that's, it's the whole theme of the podcast. At least I try to, right. Is not to be afraid of any questions. Although I do try to avoid getting too political. There's plenty of those shows out there. In coalescing your thoughts for this book, do you think it's made you a better leader or a better father? Because I would guess that trying to get your head around 100,000 words worth of content, to put it in a book and to say to yourself, okay, what's the lesson I want to convey to people? What's that nugget at the end of the chapter, like you talked about? You're then probably going to carry those nuggets with you in perhaps a more formal way in your mind than you did before you sat down and wrote the book. So do you feel like the act of writing this has made you better at these things?
I don't know if it's made me better, but it's made me more aware. I feel like I've put myself out there in a way that now there's a standard that I'm being held up to. And none of us are perfect. And I talk about that in the book by any means. I mean, I get frustrated just like everyone else gets frustrated. There's customer service interactions that I have with folks, and I'm thinking to myself, serenity now, don't explode, right? And you realize that someone on the other end of the phone, they're really just trying to help you, right? They're not, I say this in the book, or I may say this in my second book, which people don't come to work to do a bad job. I mean, there's a couple people out there that will ruin it for everyone, but in general, people want to do a good job. People want to be rewarded. People want to solve problems, right? They want to feel productive. They want to feel valued. And so I try to think about that a lot. And I try to put myself out there in a way that believes that. And again, as hard as it may be. So I think it's, like I said, I'm not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it does make me more aware of I should practice what I'm preaching. But I'll just also say this is putting a book out there with principles and beliefs and those kinds of things is really putting yourself out there. Right. And, the biggest concern I had was with the book in general was accidentally tripping on a wire that I didn't even know existed that was going to set off a bomb somewhere. And I did not want to offend anybody just because it's so easy to do in this cancel culture world that we live in.
Well, that's fair. That kept me from doing this podcast for a year or two. Is I was like, okay, what's the theme? What do I want to talk about? Because again, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, I don't really want to talk about politics. Not only is that something where it's so easy to offend somebody, it's also just there's plenty of that content. My goal has always just been to put something out there that maybe somebody can get a nugget from, to sort of use your language and your concept. If everybody gets one nugget from each episode, even just one, that hopefully is a good use of their effort and mine. And so I think that I
So
can
here's a
relate.
nugget for you.
Yeah, please.
My daily goal is to solve more problems than I cause.
I think that's a good one.
So it's interesting, right? And
Yeah.
most people, when you tell them that, they laugh and they sit back and think about it. And, probably as you're contemplating it right this second, it's like, if everybody just solved more problems than they caused each day, we'd all be better off.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right.
So tell me your thoughts on this. I agree with that. That's a great goal. I think I have thought often in perhaps some of my more cynical moments in life that, you look around at a given thing in your company, in your life, in the world, and you go, wow, that's a low bar for success. Everybody has at least one of those a week. I guarantee it. You're listening out there and you have one thing at your company and you're like, that's okay. We tolerate that level of mediocrity or whatever. And what those cynical moments that I have, or I go, just imagine how much better the world would be if we could ratchet up just a little bit from some of those tolerances for low performance, or those tolerances for mediocrity, or whatever that I'm speaking of. And I'm speaking admittedly very generically, because I don't know what every listener's industry is or what their examples in their brain might be. But I think that's could be a version of what you're talking about, which is like solving more problems than you're causing. But where I'm going to try to blend those two concepts together of like trying to help with raising the bar combined with your concept of solving more problems than we cause. I want to bring it back to, is that, to your mind, is that mindset or is that skill set?
I think it's some of both, actually. So one of the chapters in the book that you'll read eventually, I hope, or listen to eventually, is it's called Failure is Necessary. And I strongly believe that if you're not failing at something, then you're not trying hard enough. Right. I think we've created an environment and a culture, and even raising our kids, we want to protect them from failure. We want to protect our teams at work from failure, that failure is a negative. Right. In reality, failure is how we learn. It's how you grow. And if you're not pushing yourself and your limits to expand and grow, then you're eventually going to die. Right. I mean, your organization, your team, whatever it is, will become irrelevant because you're going to get bypassed. You'll get outsourced. You'll get something. Right. And so you've got to try to take on new initiatives. And that means, when I say failure, I don't mean putting the entire organization or team at risk. I'm not talking about driving 150 miles an hour down the highway and trying to figure out whether or not you're going to crash. Right. What I'm talking about is taking on something that you're not sure if it's going to work. Right. And maybe a small project here, so like a test, a pilot, a alpha site, whatever you want to call it, and try to change something that, like you said, in these organizations that are so steadfast where the bar is so low, right? And if you can get those small wins, everybody benefits, right? The people who are part of it benefit, the organization benefits, and it becomes sort of a, what they call that, a flywheel, right? Yeah. And it starts building upon itself, right? Where people believe that they can actually make a difference, right? And if you fail fast and you learn from it. And you just hopefully don't break too many things in the process.
I think it was Harvard. I read about an experiment a couple years ago where Harvard did like a, popsicle stick bridge building experiment, and they put kindergartners up against the NBA squad, and the NBA squad lost hard because they were trying to plan to perfection, and the kindergartners just tried it and it failed, and they tried something different and it failed, and they tried something different and it failed. And so they made more progress because they weren't afraid of failure. It's spot on to what you're talking about, I think it was Harvard. Somebody could go look it up, or maybe I'll see if I can find a link.
I read something similar, which was they brought in executive teams to do an exercise similar to what you're talking about. and then they brought in the administrative assistants that supported the executives. And when they brought the administrative assistants in, the productivity and success rate went up by 80, 100%, something crazy, right? To do the exact same exercise in different organizations. So it's just fascinating, right?
Oh, absolutely. Well, and the human dynamics of any of these situations, we I think you talked about, we've lost some community. We've and that loss of community has enabled us to maybe not treat each other as well, and things like this. And that's something that the thoughts that you put together in everyday leadership can help with. But we also, I think, honestly, I think myself included, generally speaking, pretty good lives, and that has created an enhanced fear of failure, because you don't want to lose what you have. You don't want to lose a good thing. And I wonder how we can, as leaders, if there's ways we can manufacture that for our team. That, by manufacture it, I mean create circumstances where they know that failure is okay, because what matters is creativity and thinking of a new solution, or just moving the needle forward on something that's been stuck for a year. Projects get stuck. It sucks, but we need new approaches. But if people are afraid, so any thoughts on how leaders can, I don't want to say manufacture, how they can create circumstances that allow for failure to be tolerated, given that societally we seem to be more afraid of failure than ever?
Yeah, I think it's part of your goals and it's part of your team, right? I mean, when you're coming up all teams come up with goals, et cetera, right? And you spend a ton of time working through it, and half the time it's never even used in organizations. But you come up with these things. And one of the things I would ask folks occasionally would be like, well, so what are you going to try that's new and different, right? Or what can we try that's new and different? What's one thing, even if it doesn't work? Like, what ideas do you have? One of the things that I did when I was in the healthcare organization is I called it Idea Survivor. And I had all of our directors, there were, I think, about 36 of them at the time. And then there were my direct reports, and there were 8 plus an executive assistant. And we had an Idea Survivor Day. And I intentionally put the directors all at a table, different tables, and sort of intermingled the disciplines. And they basically had Idea Survivor. And I basically said, you've got to present your idea, and you've got to get it, the best idea from this table. Then you're just going to go present it to my direct reports, and my direct reports are basically going to judge which are the best ideas we're going to take forward, right? Because you only have so many resources, right? I mean, you have limited bandwidth. But what that did is a handful of things. One, it made everybody feel like that they mattered, because I was asking everyone to bring their ideas. And then they got to hear everyone else's ideas compared to what their ideas are. So it wasn't one of these situations where myself or some unknown committee was basically shooting down their idea, right? Their idea may have been very valid. I used to joke, one of my direct reports used to find $1 million opportunity every week, and we could never get to them because we were working on the $5 and $10 million opportunities, right?
Right.
And that may sound silly, but you only have so many time and resources, like I said before. So when the directors could hear what these other opportunities are and how they could potentially impact the organization as a whole, or the whole team as a whole, et cetera, they realize that maybe their thing that they really want isn't as important or as valuable or as critical. And so going through that, people got to hear everyone else's ideas. And then what we did is we actually took on the challenges that the teams thought were the best, right? The top 3, 2 of them were very similar in nature. We took it on as a project, and we did it, right? And so the team realized, oh my gosh, they care about my feedback, and we're going to try these things. And then some of the other ones that were some of the smaller ideas, we also tried to do those as well, right? So there's ways you can implement these things into your organization and then demonstrate that it's okay to fail. I mean, there was a couple of things that I tried that I basically said, look, this is 100% on me, but we're going to try this. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And, if once you say it's okay to fail, then it becomes sort of ingrained in the culture that it's okay, right? So it's just it's a matter of trust, right? And if you have trust, you can do those kinds of things. But too often, if trust isn't there, then people feel like they're the scapegoat, or they're going to be held out, as the one who failed. And that's, I don't believe in general people fail. I believe that the processes fail. And as a result, people are made to look bad because there's bad process. Now, people can be terrible communicators, and, that could be a source of failure, or they just may not have the skills, as you offered up earlier, to be able to execute. But, that's a separate conversation we can get into, or a separate question.
Yeah, I think that the failure of individuals, I mean, there's so much that can fail first. Process, culture. You could be, I think I've run into this in my career, just kind of admittedly. I probably fit in a certain size organization better than in others, and perform better, just based on performance feedback over my career. And I think that's true of everybody. And then there's processes, and then there's the personalities, and then there's so much before we get to the individual. But there are individuals who probably just don't step up. And then how much of that is what's going on in their personal life, and mom died, or like husband or spouse or whatever's got something going on. I mean, there's so many factors, and I think that that's something that we should try to, when we can, as leaders, listen to. And I think that brings me to communication, as well as some of what you said in your last answer brings me to communication, which you said is the other half of the book, from mindset. Specific to failure, then, we're sort of become the failure dialogue here. How explicit do you think that leaders should be in our willingness to accept failure in exchange for, essentially in exchange, that sounds very transactional, but in exchange for the potential for creativity and progress? Meaning, would you ever tell your teams, hey, I it's okay if this one goes wrong, I just need you to get out of the box, or something like that? Or do you think it needs to be more subtext, because calling it out can create a ripple effect or a negative effect somehow? What are your thoughts on the communicating that tolerance for failure?
Yeah, I think it's both, actually. And I think it just depends on how big of exposure there is of something like that, right? I mean, there's ideas at the end. So part of I think what our challenge is today, let me answer it this way, is we optimize at the very micro level at the expense of the macro. And I think we do that in business. I think we're doing that in society. And we're trying to figure out how to make it so that everybody feels, or every team feels, et cetera, that their role or their place or their belief is valued, accepted, et cetera. And we're doing it literally at the expense of at the whole process. And if you think about that at a company level, what you end up doing is creating, what I would call diseconomies of scale. Like some of these really large health systems that I've had an opportunity to either work at or consult for over the years, some of them have reached literally diseconomies of scale, because they've got people who are so specific in what they do that they have no idea what's happening before them, or what kinds of challenges they're creating after it touches them. And as a result, they're just optimizing for their one little thing. And that's all that they see, right? And the job description is set up that that's what they're focused on, and that's it. And what I really try to do when I look for leaders, and you talk about culture, are people who have the ability to see beyond their little thing. They've got to be able to look back, and they've got to be able to look forward, because if you can't do that, the entire thing will not get optimized, right? I mean, it's everything becomes suboptimal when you optimize every point along the way. I mean, there are winners and losers along a continuum of process. There has to be, or it's unsustainable, right? I mean, otherwise you'd say, well, why don't they build the entire airplane out of the stuff they make the black box out of? The black box survives the airline crash. Well, the plane would never fly. It'd be too heavy, right? Like, that's what ends up happening in these organizations. We're creating black boxes everywhere along the way, and they're just dying upon the weight of themselves. And you can't get to the process that's optimized at the end. And so to me, creating that sort of failure, elements, right, along the way are changing something here that may make a metric go off the charts, but the metric probably didn't matter anyways, right? It's a BS metric, excuse my language, but it's one of those industry norms that's always been out there, right? You came out of healthcare revenue psycho. I call it revenue psycho, not revenue cycle, but revenue psycho. And, AR days is the most famous one of them all, right? I can make the AR days be whatever you want, and I can do it in a multitude of different ways, but that doesn't mean that it's actually in the benefit of the organization.
Right. Oh, that's funny. Oh, there's so much in that. Like
Sorry.
where to go? Oh my gosh. So, I mean, besides the revenue psycho comment, which I'll leave alone. But I think so. Sticking with communication, I think you're absolutely right, and I don't think it's just healthcare that we get the modern economies have created ultra large and or ultra specialized functions division. I mean, you could have a very small 3-person consulting firm, but they're so ultra niche to meet the need of a hospital or of the Department of Defense or of Chase Bank or whatever, but they're super ultra niche, right? And nobody else can figure out what to do. I mean, good for them. They'll probably do well financially, but are but I don't think these ultra specialists can remain in vacuums for long without enhancing that community and communication that we've already talked about today. And so for this sort of segment of the dialogue, what are some tips that you might have for people, whether they are middle managers, senior managers, or just workers, to try to reach across silos from their super specialty to another super specialty and enhance that dialogue and communication and community?
I think probably one of the most underrated, undervalued skills is curiosity.
Mm.
I think that being curious is something that you talk about with kids earlier in that example, that, how the kindergartners beat the Harvard Business School students, right? Part of that is just pure curiosity. I see it in my 6-year-old every day. And I think as adults, we stop becoming curious and we just start conforming, right? More than anything, right? 6-year-olds will go out and just dance. Like people who, men in their 50s and 40s or whatever aren't going to just go out on the floor and dance, so to speak. They've got to get pulled out there. But I think curiosity, and I talk about that in the book, having a curiosity of understanding of how what I'm doing impacts everything else, right? And that's one of the things I felt like I did, or tried to promote across the organization as a leader, is having people understand how what they did every day impacted the results of the organization. When I say impacting the results of the organization, I'm talking about in the healthcare side, impacting the patients, impacting the financials, impacting the quality, impacting our cost, or impacting our revenue. I guess that's part of financials, but impacting our service to the communities, right? Everything that we do, right, has an impact, and understanding how you have an impact on that is huge, right? I think so often you just get in this rut and routine of doing the exact same thing over and over again, whether it be at home or at work or in life, and you lose sight of why you're actually doing what you're doing. And so I think having that curiosity, whether it be trying a new workout routine or trying a new hobby or doing something that you may have never done before, like go see a ballet or an opera or a musical or something like that, if you're a big sports fan, or vice versa, it may give you an appreciation for something that you just didn't have before. And so I just tell people to have curiosity. And I know that's sort of a weird statement probably in some ways to answer the question, but you don't learn unless you're curious, in my opinion. I mean, it's just you won't learn enough.
I don't think it's a weird answer. I think it's a good one. I think that because if I'm somebody who's, regardless of rank, it can apply, that message can apply to them. They could be the CEO, or they could be the entry level data entry clerk. It doesn't matter. You can be curious about the person next to you's job, the person above you's job. I mean, whatever. So I think it's a good answer for no other reason than the broad applicability across hierarchy within an organization. So it's great. As we head into the last sort of quarter of the call here, I want to do, I usually like to do one or two sort of career-minded questions, and then I've got sort of a New Year's one I want to wrap us up with. So 10 years in the making, writing the book coach. And there may be many other people out there with ideas about writing. What would be a lesson learned from this that you would give to other aspiring writers?
Oh, David, there are so many lessons along the way. I would tell them to reach out to people who have attempted the process. Going through the process, what was really interesting to me is how, when I finally made it public that I was writing a book, how many people came up to me and secretly either had written a book that they never published or had topics for a book or wanted to write a book. It was really fascinating, the number of people that are out there that want. And I will just tell you that it's so rewarding. It's just like everything else. You'll get out of it what you put into it. And, if you set your expectations appropriately, again, I didn't set out to write a New York Times bestseller. I'm still in search of lightning in a bottle. And if it happens, that'd be great. But, that wasn't the point. The point was, is it could get into people's hands. And like you said at the very beginning, is make a small difference in people's lives every day that makes, the interactions they have with others better and makes their lives better. And then it becomes a cascading effect. And so I would just say, hey, talk to other people who have done it. Everyone that I talked to, there's over a dozen people, and I reference them in the book around people who helped me through the process. People absolutely love to help. That's the other thing I've realized. Asking for help is one of my weaknesses, but I cannot thank people enough for sharing their time, their knowledge, their insight, because it's not easy to get through the different stages of it. It is one of, if not the hardest thing I've ever done. Probably the second hardest thing I've ever done.
What's the hardest thing you ever did?
Being president of my undergraduate fraternity.
Oh,
by far.
Interesting.
I'll just say why. Yeah, just in 2 sentences, why is you're 21 years old, you're leading 150 18 to 21-year-olds who don't think the laws apply to them. Your stakeholders are just out the crazy wazoo with the university, the city, the school, the parents, right? I mean, the national fraternity, the alumni. I mean, you just name it. There's just so many stakeholders, and you have a $300,000 annual budget. And at the time, fraternities were the third worst insurance risk behind toxic waste dumps and nuclear reactors. So you are literally managing this just tremendously risky thing. And, my goal was just not to be the last president.
Wow. The third. Wow. Okay. Well, you
learn
something
it's
every
crazy,
day.
Isn't it? But it's shaped me in how I lead more than anything else I've ever done.
I could see that. I could see that for sure.
Yeah.
It's just not something I would have thought about. And had you not mentioned it, well, I'm glad I asked that question. Gosh, third word. Okay. Not to tangent us too much, but let me reel it back in then. So, okay. So writing the book, difficult, ask for help, reach out to people who've already done it or tried to do it and learn from them. Great wisdom. So that's one of the things that you've done over the last few years that wanted to get your wisdom on. The next thing is, speaking broadly, what advice would you have to aspiring healthcare leaders, not necessarily in revenue psycho, as you called it, but just broadly, what advice would you have to aspiring healthcare leaders?
I would say to get exposure to leadership outside of healthcare. I think the healthcare leadership itself, and in many ways, is still taught to be command and control models, and the way that things are incentivized and structured in these healthcare organizations is just, again, it's in many ways, it's unfortunately dehumanizing. And again, I'm not speaking about any specific organization or anything like that. I'm just talking about many organizations that I've come into contact with over the years but I really do believe that if you can look at some of the other organizations that are out there and understand things like service profit chains that retail uses, et cetera, because these large health systems, in my opinion, are they're going to be dinosaurs, right? There isn't one person that you will find on the planet right this minute that wants to go to a hospital, right? There is not one person, right? If you could go get a service, whether it be an X-ray, an MRI, a CT, an infusion, physical therapy, occupational therapy, you name it, outpatient surgery, people are avoiding those hospitals left and right, right? And if all those things that I just mentioned, not all of them, but we'll throw sleep studies into that as well, are some of the highest margin services that those hospitals have had in the past. The financial model for healthcare systems and hospitals is just broken. It literally is just completely broken. And so understanding what is happening in retail and how other businesses work is going to be really, really important for the future, I believe, because that's who your competition is. It isn't other hospitals and health systems.
Okay, so we covered aspiring authors. We covered aspiring healthcare leaders. Since we've discovered, or at least decided, that your book has largely self-help uh, tones, we'll call it, to it. What advice for parents would you put out there in the world today?
I think stop trying to make everything from people looking at the outside as perfect as you want it to seem,
Mm.
because it is not. We all know it, you know. And so the pretty pictures everybody's posting on Facebook are wonderful, but maybe you need to post a picture of your dog throwing up every once in a while, and the kid getting up at 3 a.m. with the stomach flu or whatever else, right? I mean, it's,
Mm-hmm.
again, people aren't complaining about it, but it makes you real, it makes you human. And that's what I think people want to connect with. People don't want to connect with fake, right? I think people want to connect with real and authentic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all have our challenges. Everybody's dealing with something, right? And it may seem like the neighbor's kids got the smartest or best grades and off to a prestigious university or something like that. But I can assure you they're dealing with something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody is. And people are willing to talk about it, is what I found, more than people are willing to make themselves vulnerable and
Mm-hmm.
share and help, because it takes a village. It really does. And I
Mm-hmm.
think I have a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for my parents and prior generations who laid the foundation for me to be able to do the things that I'm doing today, right? And I think in a lot of ways we're not setting that same foundation up for our kids. We want them to have a better life than us, right? Every parent and family does, but we're created an environment where it's perfection over learning. It's
Yeah.
perfection over the process. And, I think just focusing on the process, you'll be so much happier and you'll enjoy it a lot more than trying to focus on trying to get something perfect.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. Okay, and then to wind us up, if there was, since this is a sort of a New Year's episode, what's one resolution you would hope that listeners or readers of your book, besides getting and reading the book if they haven't yet, and I'll tell you, this certainly is going to move it up my list. I had an idea of what it was about, but it's about a few different things, and so while my list is long, I think we can notch it up several spots after today's conversation. But what's one resolution that you would hope a listener would make for 24?
I'll go back to two things that I've said throughout the call today, is one, have curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you're someone who always watches Fox News, turn on MSNBC and just listen. Don't get
Mm-hmm.
frustrated. And if you're watching MSNBC, turn on Fox News,
Mm-hmm.
and just, because the dialogue is completely different.
Mm-hmm.
But those people are your neighbors, and we've got to figure out as a country on how to get along,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that goes back to also, my goal every day is to try to solve more problems than you cause, right? And so if you could do one or both of those things, I think the world and your communities and your families and your teams at work will all be in a much better place at the end of 24 than where you start.
That sounds great. That sounds like a good resolution. Stay curious, solve more problems than you cause. Those are great resolutions. I might add some sort of weight loss or weight management solution to that for myself. A lot of others make that, but relevant to today's dialogue, those sound really great. So, Brian, I appreciate you coming on and talking with me here on No Bad Questions. I think we covered a lot of ground. And where can people find the book? I assume it's out on the um, the Amazon and things like that. Is there an audio version for people who don't like to maybe read books these days? They like audiobooks. Where can people find it?
There's digital versions and all the different formats. And you mentioned Kindle earlier. It's available wherever books are sold. So you can get it at Barnes & Noble or Amazon or any place it's available commercially. And yes, there is an audio version that you can listen, whether it be Audible or the other formats as well. So one of my goals was to make it as widely available as possible, because, again, I hope just people can pick it up and make a difference in their lives, of themselves and the others that they interact with. So I would appreciate any feedback that you get. And if you like the book, please leave a review out there so others will see it. And if you don't like the book, let me know, because I'm writing another one, as I mentioned, and I'd love to get your feedback, because the only way I know how to make improvements or to change something is to get feedback. So give me that feedback if you don't mind.
Awesome. Perfect. Brian Unell, thank you for joining me on No Bad Questions. And for everybody out there, Happy New Year.
Thank you, David, for having me. I greatly appreciate this opportunity, and Happy New Year to you and your audience as well.